Tell us a little bit about your career to date, Stuart.
Well, I worked all my career, more or less, in the NHS, in various management roles. The last 23 years as an NHS Trust Chief Executive, until I retired earlier this year.
That's obviously a very varied career over a long period of time. What are the sorts of jobs that you've covered during that time?
Well, I started as an NHS graduate trainee, and that involved, first of all, getting a good oversight of the whole of the immensely complex health and care system, which is one of the good things that training scheme did. And then, you work your way up through jobs, operational management jobs in hospitals. I worked for a while, as you know, doing consultancy, organisational development consultancy, with a range of different sort of hospitals and health authorities in the south of England. Worked for a time as a civil servant in the Department of Health at a regional and a national level, acting as the sort of crossover point between the various different policy branches and how that was put into practice in performance management, the growing school of performance management as it was back in the 1990s. And then, the sort of last 2/3 of my career really were as chief executives of NHS trusts, for quite short periods of time at the beginning, and then a long period of time at South London and Maudsley, which is a mental health trust. And then most recently, the last 8 years or so at Oxford Health, which is a mental health and community trust.
So looking back over all those different jobs, what were the bits that you most enjoyed?
Oh, it's a marvellous career for just meeting a whole range of incredibly interesting people. So the thing I enjoyed most was the company of my colleagues and the various people that I came to meet in those different roles. Because one of the nice things I think about working in the NHS is that you do truly get to meet a very, very broad range of people. A lot of my contemporaries went into careers where largely you get to meet people who are like you, the sort of people you went to school with, the sort of people you went to university with, are the sort of people that you work with. And in the NHS, all of life literally is there, and that's very special, I think.
I guess for many of us, mental health, particularly in the NHS, feels quite a grim area to be in, a kind of a difficult area. It's not one of the Cinderella high-profile ones. What drew you into that particular area?
It was by accident at first. I went into mental health not really having had much in-depth experience of it beforehand, and went in it really in my first trust chief executive job. And you're right. I think it is considered historically as a Cinderella service, as they're sometimes called. I think a lot of people are pretty ignorant about it. I think people are sometimes rather frightened of it. There are a lot of misconceptions, and in many respects, I think the last few years have been very exciting in that, the possibilities of effective treatment for mental illnesses are in the midst of, really significant change at the moment, both in terms of the understanding of what prompts mental illnesses, what can be done about it, massive development of psychological treatments over the last few years. So it's a field where, you can actually see the ground changing around you in terms of the possibilities, but it's still staggeringly neglected as part of healthcare systems internationally. We do pretty well in this country relative to many, many others in the developed world, but it's still the case here that only around 25–30% of people who would benefit from treatment for mental illness actually get access to it in this country. Whereas if you compare that with most physical illnesses, it would be about 85–90% get access to treatment. So if you had that sort of issue in relation to any of the major physical health problems, it would be a national outrage and scandal. And yet that's been the case for a long period of time. We are gradually beginning to make progress, and sometimes we slip back again. And you're quite right. It's physical healthcare that often grabs the headlines and the attention, and therefore the resources. But there's still a long way to go. I think there's a growing appreciation of just how important good mental well-being is, for the country as a whole, socially, economically, and for physical well-being. And of course, all of that's been thrown into sharp relief by the pandemic experience. But people sort of get that at one level, but it doesn't necessarily translate into changing things as it perhaps should.
Picking up on your Cinderella image a moment ago, let's imagine Cinderella has pinched the fairy godmother's magic wand. If you could wave the magic wand over the sphere of mental health and public perception and the unlocking of resources, what would you want to change? What would be the key thing that the magic wand would change?
Well, I don't think there's one key thing. The thing that always was my biggest anxiety when I was in work was where are the staff going to come from for the future. That's a general problem across health and social care, and I think there was something like 100,000 vacancies across the NHS, and that was particularly marked and acute in some of the trickiest areas of mental health care. I mean, if you look at things like nursing on inpatient wards, it became really hard to attract people. But and it takes years to build that up, and you need experienced people to train the next generation. So there's a long-term investment to be put in there. At the same time, I think that there's still been historically too much emphasis across all healthcare, actually, not just mental health care, about it being something where practitioners do things to or for patients, rather than health and care being things that are jointly produced. Co-produced is the jargon, but I think of it as a sort of joint endeavour. And if you're short of people, then that's a good way of beginning to address the issue and thinking about how you can mobilise all of the assets that people can bring to their own circumstances when they've got mental health problems. But that's it's easy to say. It's actually jolly hard work to mobilise that in practice. But that's Indeed. one of the areas that I think I would want to concentrate on, is how you can do more of that. But at a very simple, basic level, you need to put some more time and energy and effort in, and for that you need people, and for that you need money to be able to bring those people in and to make it an attractive career for them, which it isn't always.
You seem to be suggesting, I think, that it's a long-term issue. So I wonder what kept you going, what kept you motivated and driven when there's been a consistent period of the lack of resources. What drove you in that career?
Well, I could see that it was really important. I think it's vastly more interesting than an awful lot of what are superficially the sort of glamorous bits of healthcare, because it brings into play many of the sort of questions about the interaction, not just about what medicines, drugs, and other healthcare interventions do to disease, but you have to think much more deeply about the relationship between you know, the social and economic circumstances in which people find themselves, you know, the nature of life, if you like, as factors that determine people's mental well-being. You know, things like proximity to nature and the like. Those have a material bearing on people's health in quite complex ways, but ways in which, if you just try and ignore them and treat it as a, you know, kind of production line sort of business, which, you know, some aspects of healthcare are a bit more amenable to. I mean, if you're doing things like hip replacements, it's a mechanical procedure. There's still a human dimension to it, which of course the best people in that field really get and understand. But it's possible to look at it in that sort of way, and so many of the lenses through which healthcare is examined treat it as a form of production management, and it's actually not. It's much more complicated than that, and you are confronted with that more directly in the field
of all of the health. Sorry.
No, sorry.
I guess of all the health service disciplines, it's perhaps the most intense, people-intensive section, if that kind of makes sense. I just wonder whether, now looking back on that career, what would you say is your legacy?
Well, I think the most important thing in the sorts of jobs I did that you can do to leave something which makes a lasting difference is to attract good people into your bit of the service, and that's at every level. Attract and retain, because of course, you know, there are always good people there to start off with, but their spirits need to be kept up too, and they need to be kept motivated and with a sense of purpose and ambition. So what you leave behind that will last is if there's a really good crew of people, and you know just what a difference it makes to the quality of care people will get, whether there's a good bunch of people there or a indifferent group of people. So I think that is the best form of legacy. Having said that, part of what attracts people and what keeps people is, I think, a sense of ambition. So I hope, particularly in the two places where I was around for a period of time, I helped to create a sense of ambition, and places being a bit outward looking and not just being a bit sort of satisfied saying, oh, well, we seem to be doing reasonably well, you know, all of the indicators are all right. But you keep asking yourself, well, you know, what can we learn from elsewhere? How could we be better still for the future? And an area that I've been particularly interested in is in the interaction between the NHS and academia, particularly clinical academia, and how you can foster that sort of relationship to develop new treatments and to, you know, build those foundations for the longer term. And probably, I think, the most significant single sort of thing that I managed to pull off in my career was there are things called biomedical research centres, which are funded by the National Institute of Health Research, and they do the translation from basic research into treatment and care. And there was only one for mental illness, which was at the trust I was at for 13 years, South London and Maudsley. So we actually established, there'd been a previous sort of arrangement, but we established the first exclusively mental health biomedical research centre there. And that was the only one in the country. Whereas if you looked around for cancer and heart disease, there are at least half a dozen places looking at them. And then we managed to establish the second one from a relatively, standing start, in that there hadn't been any previous sort of equivalent apparatus in place. I mean, there was an immensely strong department of psychiatry at the University of Oxford, but in Oxford. So there are now two. So And that, I think, is something that, will still be having an impact in 10, 20, 30 years' time. In fact, it will probably only be realizing its full potential in 10, 20, 30 years' time. But it's good to have been part of laying the foundations of that. And in turn, that, I think, helps to raise the profile of mental illness. It creates a sort of sense of hope and possibility about the prospects of effective treatment. I mean, look how excited everybody's getting about the possibility of a vaccine for COVID. Those things make a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And it makes it the kind of place people will want to go and work, which is good for local people in the trust services. That it's the kind of place that some of the best folk in the world will be interested in going to.
So if you look back over that, a long career, it's a career that's had some public recognition of the quality of the work that you've done. What's the bit that you think you personally have got out from it? In just a sentence, what have you taken away from that career?
Well, I feel as though I have spent my working life doing something worthwhile. So it's been more than just a job. And I remember when I started out, I was thinking, oh, well, I want something that's more than just a job. Everybody sort of says that, don't they? But it has really felt like that all the way through. I've learned a huge amount as I've gone through it, and made some very good friends. And I hope that I get a sense of satisfaction out of what I feel is having laid foundations for something. I mean, there's things that you do at the time but there's so much sort of white noise comes through all work systems, isn't there, that it's actually quite difficult to tell which of those various things that you do matter. I think as I became a relatively grumpy old man in my career, increasingly unimpressed by all of the sort of white noise, which was the sort of conventional markers of achievement as they came through, because you could just see that, in 5 years' time, nobody even remember what they were about. So you've got to focus on those things which you do believe are going to be enduring.
And you talked very clearly there about what you would take away from that sense of time and career. So, Stuart, we've looked back and reflected. You've helped us reflect on your career and what you've taken from it. Let's look forward a minute and look to the point where maybe it's your funeral eulogy, maybe it's that kind of key birthday event in life, and you're looking back. What's the eulogy that you would like to hear being said about you that would leave you feeling proud?
Well, this is a very interesting point, because my attention was drawn recently to the difference which exists between the sorts of speeches that people make at people's leaving dues, their retirement dues, and the sorts of speeches that get made at people's funerals, their eulogies. And when I said I was retiring, some people do begin to treat it as though you're dying rather than just sort of retiring. You have to sort of say, no, actually, it's not the end as far as I'm concerned. But there is a difference, I think. And, when people make a eulogy, they will talk predominantly about people's families and their friends and their animals and the sorts of things they were interested in. And there probably will be some mention of what they did at work, but it would be unusual. And I think people would feel it a bit disappointing if that were the major part of what passed in their eulogy. There are, people talk about how people were as people. Whereas at people's leaving dues, their retirements or whatever, you do tend to get a bit of a sort of catalogue of the CV sometimes. And actually, I managed to escape that, and there were some very nice, broader things that were said at my my own leaving do, for which I was very grateful. But it's an interesting question, isn't it? Which is the person that really matters? The one that is memorialized at the retirement speech, or the one in the eulogy? And what does that tell us about the extent to which what we do in our work lives has meaningful connection with, crossover with, overlap with what we see as our true identities, or are they completely separate spheres?
So let me put you on the spot then. What would you like to hear said about you at your eulogy that's broader than just the retirement eulogy?
Well, yeah, I hope that it will be recognised that I've had a broader range of interests in my life than just those which are related to what I've done in my working career. I actually think there's been an important relationship between the two, because I think, you know, if you can help bring your broader range of interests to bear in what you do at work, you will probably do a better job. That, you know, if you become technocratic or a sort of, you know, work junkie in any sphere of life, where you become so preoccupied by the technical minutiae of your sphere of work that you don't really see beyond it, then you're probably missing something. And I think that's true, you know, at all levels, no matter what the seniority of the role. I think, you know, if people are often outstanding because of what they bring to their jobs from outside their jobs, no matter what it is that they're doing. And a great deal of that is their own personality and their humanity. I think that helps sustain it. So I would hope that that people felt that they'd experienced that as part of their experience of me. And as I say, it was quite nice that there was some of that when I retired as well. So if the two are, you know, not a million miles apart, that's probably a good sign, I would say.
But you raise an interesting point there with the comparison, because I guess there could be a temptation for some people to feel that there is no life beyond retirement, in a sense. That is the eulogy, that is the summation of all that they've done. When you were coming up to retirement and looking into that, I was going to say void beyond, did it feel like a void? Did you have a clear sense of what you wanted to do when you walked away from the health service for the final time?
Well, I haven't completely walked away from the health service because I've still got one or two bits of involvement in retirement. No, I certainly didn't think of it as a void. I had a strong sense that I wanted to be able to have a bit more flexibility over how I used my time, because inevitably in any job you are obliged to, you know, consumes a lot of your time, and I think senior roles consume more and more of people's time, especially, you know, given the way in which technology has developed. And in practice, because my last few months were spent in the middle of the you know, the peak of the first peak of the pandemic, it was all consuming. It was, you know, kind of in a rather ironic way, just made that point very, very stark. But I knew that I was going to really miss, you know, the people that I worked with, and hope to be able to keep in touch. And again, you know, thankfully, I've been able to do that, given all of the constraints that there are about that. Though, you know, technology does seem to be helpful in new ways with that. But it certainly didn't feel like a void. It felt like an opportunity to be able to, you know, exercise a bit more discretion myself over how my time was spent doing the things that I was really interested in, even though I didn't have a particularly clear idea of what that was going to be. And that's still emerging as the months go by as to what that's beginning to look like. But
well, as you say, that's still quite early days. I just wonder if you are now talking to somebody in a similar position to yours, who's coming up to retirement, what would you tell them that you wished you knew or you'd done or been aware of at that time? And what would be the most significant thing for them to plan and consider?
Well, I think it's worth asking yourself what are the things that you are interested in. Just understanding what it is that it was always a good exercise at work to ask yourself, how have I really spent my time over the last month or so? What are the sorts of things to which most time and effort and thought has been devoted, and how does that correspond with the formal statement of what the priorities are? Because there's often an interesting mismatch between that. And so it's worth having a think about, what do you think are the things that you really want to spend your time on, looking to the future, and asking yourself the question, is that in fact what I end up devoting it to? If the answer comes up, there isn't very much, I'm very fortunate that I've been able to develop and retain quite a broad range of interests. I think there are some people for whom it is a big wrench because they haven't had the chance to do that for whatever reason, or they need to start cultivating that. And I can see that if you found yourself in that position, the transition might be very tricky. And I know of a number of people who sort of retired, and then within a few weeks they found themselves effectively going back to work. And sometimes I think that's the way in which people need to go about making their own transition into that. But it's worth giving a bit of thought to that in advance, I would say.
What's most surprised you in these first few months of retirement? What's been the biggest surprise?
It wasn't a surprise, but for the first few weeks, the day I retired, I had a strong physical sense of a burden being lifted from my shoulders, and I think that's the burden of responsibility that goes with the sorts of jobs that I had, and it's the kind of thing that I think you just don't notice is there until you stop, and then you realise that's there. But it was, people talk about a weight on their backs. It literally felt like a weight being lifted on my back. That was very strange. And then people had prepared me for this and said, "Oh, you're going to feel pretty tired for about a month," and I did. And I think there's just a period where you need to, catch up with. It's a bit like the case, quite often people say, oh, well, when they go on holiday, they immediately catch a cold or something like that because they've been sort of staving it off. And then, your body takes the opportunity to say, right, it's my turn now for a bit. And I think it's a kind of extended period of that. Now, that wasn't a particular surprise because, as I say, lots of people had said, that's what happened to me. And it was. I think the strength of the sense of the lifting of the sense of responsibility wasn't quite something that I was anticipating.